Today, I'd like to talk to you about protecting infrastructure before use of prescribed fire. When I refer to infrastructure, I'm thinking about homes, barns, pump houses, any of the built environment that might be near or adjacent to the prescribed fire. My name is Valachovic. I'm with the University of California in the Cooperative Extension Program, and I have expertise in home hardening, specifically in wildfire application, but that wildfire application is also suitable to thinking about prescribed fire. So I have intended this webinar to be helpful both to the homeowner or the person developing the burn plan. And in thinking about this topic, I think the main point to recognize that it's certainly possible to work near homes, barns, and outbuildings with prescribed fire. It just takes a little planning and preparation. So whatever your goal is for the prescribed fire, whether that's to manage fuels, improve range habitat, or perhaps control an invasive plant, prescribed fire is appropriate in many situations. Having prescribed fire is an important part of your toolbox. So today's presentation has three parts. I'll talk first about how to prepare the infrastructure for the prescribed fire, and then I'll go into a bit more detail about how homes burn from wildfire to be able to illustrate some of the concepts in terms of infrastructure protection. And then I'll conclude with a short presentation about how to prepare your house prior to wildfire evacuation, because some of the principles about house preparation in that situation you might think about applying in the same way in advance of this prescribed fire. So infrastructure protection. The first thing to think about is that when any prescribed fire is going to be developed, it will include a burn plan, and there will be confirmation that there are appropriate weather conditions that are suitable for your prescribed fire. The prescribed fire is not going to take place on a windy day with extreme low humidities, because those wouldn't be conditions likely to be suitable for having the kind of control and effect that you're interested in. But if the prescribed burn is near a barn, a house, a fence, this is a good time for property cleanup, just in case something is to change in the weather conditions and create a little bit harder situation to work with. Now the fire, if the prescribed fire, if it's going to move at all, it's going to be looking for fuel. And when you think about fuel, keep in mind that fuel can be any number of items: grass, hay, leaves, pine needle litter, all of that sort of obvious examples. And if you're feeding cows near the barn and you've got a bunch of hay blowing around, this is a good time to try and clean that stuff up. Additionally, the material of the barns, the siding, all that can be fuel as well. You know, another consideration is that lawn furniture and things that you have outside can also be fuel for a fire. So if you've got fire that's intentional and prescribed, you just want to try and separate that other fuel away from the ones you're trying to burn itself. In advance of applying fire to the ground, there's going to be a thoughtful plan about how to control where that fire is located. And there'll be an effort to sort of box in the area to be burned with some black. And the boxing in of that can consist of a whole combination of strategies, like mow lines, as illustrated in the photos here, use of wet lines that the igniter is working closely with, use of existing roads or cut lines and bare soil lines, ways to contain the fire. And the practitioners will build a perimeter of black around the area to be treated with prescribed fire, and that will help protect the structure if it's near the prescribed fire. Additionally, when you're thinking about infrastructure protection, you can borrow from the defensible space guidance for wildfire because it fits in sort of the same framework. Here's a couple illustrations of that defensible space guidance, in which there is, if you live in or work in an area with a lot of trees and vegetation, the idea is that you're feathering out less vegetation close to the house, out to at least 100 feet, where you've got separation between the crowns of the trees and the shrub community, and you're giving some space so that if you do have a wildfire, that will not be in the crowns of the trees. It might drop down and approach the house in a much more manageable fashion. But when you're planning for defensible space, I like to orient people to think about the house and work their way outward so that their defensible space emanates specifically from the house and your greatest protection is right at the house or the barn or whatever building you're trying to work around. So here's another illustration of that working from the house outward concept. There's a new recommendation and a bit of an addition to this framework, and that is to add a zone of 0 to 5 feet immediately around the house that has no combustible materials in it. So that can mean gravel, walkways, very low-cut grass, irrigated lawn, pavers, some separation that separates the siding from the combustible materials. Outside of that zone is a great place to put other types of plantings and landscaping, but with a general aim towards reducing the amount of woody fuels in that next zone. The third zone has this reduced fuel line with an approach that's trying to separate the vegetation from each other, like those images were shown just a moment ago. So why does that matter? Well, let's look into how homes burn from wildfire, because I think this will help us understand why that separation is super important and how to be thinking about prescribed fire in relation to your own property that you're working on. So homes or buildings are lost from wildfire from three different types of exposures. The one I think most people think about is the direct flame contact, which is shown here on the right, where you've got a broom and a gutter, both of which have ignited material either in the gutter or the elements of the broom have caught on fire, and that's leading towards direct flame on the side of the house or the edge of the roof. So the material, either at the edge of the roof or the side of the house, has to be designed and maintained well enough that it can resist the amount of heat and flame from that material that is caught on fire. Radiant heat is also another important component. So if your barn catches on fire and your house is adjacent, or your woodshed, or your pump house, or your garage, if any of those are to catch on fire and they're in close proximity to your house, you could experience a radiant heat type of combustion that leads the home to catch on fire. It can also easily be your neighbor's house if you live in a tight neighborhood. The more common way, however, that homes are ignited is really through the release of embers or firebrands. These are little bits of burning vegetation that have been caught up in the wind. And most of the wildfires where we have large amounts of home loss tend to be wind-driven events. And this image is taken from a laboratory setting, but it very much looks like what can occur in a wildfire situation that's wind-driven, where bits of material are just thrown at the house and they find the little nooks and crannies, the little weak places to enter the house. We'll go through that in a bit more detail next. So embers, as I said, are responsible for the majority of building ignitions. And here's an image from South Lake Tahoe and the Angora fire, where you can see that the surrounding pine forest was really not involved in this fire, in this image, but the home was lost. So how is it that the home was lost but the vegetation was not? And that is because the embers were able to land in the home, and the home was much more combustible than the surrounding vegetation. So the pathways for entry all relate to this idea that you can catch bits of material on fire either outside your house, like such as this needle or leaf accumulation next to this dormer on the roof, in the gutters, as we talked about earlier, or perhaps catching the fence, a wood fence that connects to your house on fire, bringing the fire to the house, or more commonly, entering via ventilation. The ventilation system in your house is super important. It's designed to let hot, moist air out and cool air in to create a nice circulation system. However, that facilitates two-way exchange. And so if the ventilation system has large screen openings, it's possible for little bits of material that are on fire to penetrate through those vents and then land on the inside of your house, inside your attic, for example. And if you store something in your attic, you can see how those little bits of material can easily ignite what's in your attic, and then all of a sudden you have a fire that's on the inside of your house. So we don't want to get rid of vents, but we certainly do need to think about some better ways to design them or maintain them. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So when you're thinking about survival of a building in reference to wildfire exposure, there are a lot of different components, and we'll go through these in a short amount of detail. But if I can draw your attention to the top three priorities, and those are the roof and the roof edge, the ventilation system, and then the vegetation that's immediately adjacent to the house. All of these are ripe for exposure from embers that may be blown, from a long distance, maybe as much as a mile, and it can ignite material either on or near your house. There are other components such as windows, decks, and siding, which do have importance in the overall equation of preventing home ignition, but they're a little less so. And so we'll talk about how different types of exposures in windows, decks, and siding can also be mitigated in a moment. So the roof is the top priority, and it is the largest horizontal surface on your building. And a roof can have lots of places where embers can find little homes. Those can be, as we noted earlier, along the side of where a dormer is, where material may collect there. It may be via skylights. It could be via the gutter system. It could be just the overall condition of the roof, for example, if it's worn and it is in need of repair. Or it can be through the ventilation system that may be installed in your roofing system. The roof edge is particularly important, and it's a place where there's often accidental gaps. In these two tile examples, you can see a gap on the left in the way that the cap is placed, and on the right as where the bird stops are supposed to be located. Those can fall out over time and create a perfect place for embers to get underneath and all of a sudden be exposed to the roof decking itself. So a careful inspection of your roof should look for all those little nooks and crannies and seal those up with non-combustible materials, or if it's time to replace your roof. We've talked about this already, but litter accumulation and more complex roofs create more exposures. So in both of these situations, either the shingles or the siding here are not designed to have a lot of exposure to flames, and they also become places where this material can lodge. So it doesn't take long to penetrate the siding or the shingling here with flame if there is material accumulated there. So any effort to clean that up would be a good idea. Or if you're in the design phase of a new house, the simpler the roof line, the simpler it is to maintain the roof, more robust the roof characteristics are without these kinds of complex intersecting roof angles and siding materials mixed with roofing materials. The roof edge is also particularly vulnerable because the gutter, which serves an important function of keeping water away from the siding of the house, can also accumulate other materials, in this case pine needles on the left. Embers land in the gutter and create a small fire within the gutter. It can have direct exposure to the roof edge, which can create a pathway for flame to enter underneath the roofing material itself. A metal drip edge can help take care of this situation. It's a bit of flashing. Additionally, a gutter guard can be installed with the gutters that help prevent that material from staying within the gutter. Gutter guards that are made of metal are preferable. Now, here's an illustration of both a plastic and a metal gutter. Now, the metal gutter will stay attached to the roof and roof edge, whereas the plastic gutter will potentially melt and fall away, creating another type of exposure in this house where the material may continue to smolder and burn and create exposure to the side of the house. Regardless, the important point here is to maintain the gutters and keep that material out of them as much as possible. The second priority is the ventilation system, and we've got a variety of different types of ventilation. So we've got foundation vents, we have dryer vents, we have circulation systems where you've got under eave vents that allow for inflow, we've got outlet systems where you've got these through roof vents and gable end vents. Each of these can be exposed to both flame or embers, depending on where they're located. We talked about these ideas earlier where you can have penetration via those vents, and if there's susceptible material on the inside, that material can catch on fire. So the challenge is that until recently, the standard ventilation screening that you would see to prevent animals and various things from getting inside was this 1/4-inch mesh metal screening. We've now learned that that is too large of a screen and it will facilitate ember penetration. So the new recommendations are 1/8-inch metal mesh screening. This can be added over the top of the 1/4-inch metal mesh screening, or it can be installed now. This metal mesh screening does not prevent flame penetration, but it will prevent ember penetration. It also needs to be carefully maintained so that there is not paint overspray which fills it up and then makes it so it doesn't function. Another option is the usage of some new types of vents that have been tested and confirmed that they are effective in resisting both flame and ember penetration. Here's an example of some of them that you'll see in California. These are all approved through California's Chapter 7A code, which is for wildland urban interface building design and construction. That code is overseen by the Office of the State Fire Marshal, where you can find more information about these types of screens. So let's look at them briefly. The item on the top left, item A, is a foundation vent, and it has a screen which helps resist embers, and it also has a honeycomb mesh with an intumescent treatment to it that resists flame. And what happens when there's a heat exposure to that screen is that the intumescent coating will seal up and essentially prevent any more entry. By comparison to B, B is a through roof vent, and it's got steel wool as a part of its system to prevent those ember penetrations. Item C has both the screen and baffles, which both facilitate ember and flame resistance, and this is a gable end vent as an example. Item D is also a gable end vent, and it has both ember and flame resistance built into its design. Now, each of these have a variety of prices. Item A, those are in the $30 to $40 range, and then these gable end vents, C and D, I think are somewhere in the $120 to $150, $60 range. So they are an alternative to just using the 1/8-inch metal screening that we talked about earlier. And they're really great if you know that you're likely to have flame penetration and can't give as much separation to each of the vents from the potential for flame. The fourth priority are windows and doors, and I want to talk about glass specifically and dual pane windows. If you have single pane windows, they're really subject to crackage from heat, and so you get radiant heat from a fire on the outside, and if that heat is sufficient enough, it'll lead to the failure of one of the panes. So if it's single pane, you can see why that's a problem. Double pane windows have the advantage because you've got 2 panes of glass, so you've got twice the protection potential. And if you've got tempered glass, that's even better because you can see here on the bottom that the capacity to resist heat is even greater for tempered than annealed glass. Here's an illustration of how 2-pane window system works. This was an image taken from a fire from 2018 that was in the Reading area. This was a fire that was heavily driven by wind conditions, had a lot of embers associated with it, and in this case, this house had damage to the windows. You can see this crack on the right-hand pane. That crack likely originated from the combustion of this woody plant that was in a pot right next to the window. The embers flew over the grassy lawn and landed in this woody plant and caused an ignition there. There's also some combustible mulch that is down at the bottom of the image that you can't see. Here's another illustration of how embers are able to land in susceptible material and create an entry point into a home. This again is also taken from the Reading area, where you can see that the embers landed in this landscaping area where there were some woody shrubs and trees, and those did ignite, and they created sufficient heat to cause damage to the window, which is in this case boarded up by a piece of plywood, as well as to some of the front structure here that covers the front door. So there was not sufficient amount of separation of vegetation from the house, so that amount of heat was able to create a pathway into the home. Another illustration, also from 2018, comes from the town of Paradise, which experienced a very significant home loss from a fire that was wind-driven with lots of embers associated with it. Here's an example of some of the embers we found on the lawn. They're in the palm of this person's hand here. And those embers were found all around this house. On the back porch was a cushion from a piece of outdoor furniture. You can see all the burn marks on the cushion, so you can get a sense of how much exposure this house experienced. The embers were able to travel over the lawn and the walkway and to ignite the combustible mulch that was in these plantings right outside and around the house. Each of the windows of this house had broken panes. Fortunately, only the first pane was broken and not the second pane. So you can see why both having a double pane windows is important, as well as having a non-combustible zone, because if there was no material that was combustible around this house, there probably would have been no damage to this house at all. The fifth priority is to look at decks. And decks have vulnerabilities in a couple of different ways. So I'll show that in 2 slides. I think it's easy to recognize that bits of material get caught in between the deck boards, and that material is able to be ignited pretty easily. So a couple of recommendations that we have when it comes to decking include replacement of the deck board that's right next to the house when you have an attached deck. So if you can replace that with a non-combustible deck board, that would give some more protection. So if the deck ignites, it may not actually touch the house with flame. The second point is when you're installing a deck to use foil-faced tape on the deck joists and then providing a 1/4-inch gap between the deck boards to help give a little more space so you have less material to accumulate, and then putting those joists 24-inch on center. This whole system will make it more difficult for fire to wick along those joists and bring fire from one board to the next into the house. The most important element when it comes to decks is to think about what people tend to store under them and to change pattern and practice such that you've got non-combustible areas underneath the deck so that if fire is either in a flaming front going to come to the house or in embers, that the deck doesn't ignite from the underside because the material has been stored there or because grass has been allowed to grow or there's other shrubs or other materials that have been allowed to grow which can easily ignite and then create enough heat underneath from flame to ignite the deck. Fences we talked about briefly before. Fences are more vulnerable because they tend to be made of thinner material with less density, and so it's easier to ignite that thinner material. And you can see how once you ignite a fence, and if it's an attached fence, it can bring a fire to the house itself. So the recommendation is to be aware about where your fences are located and how they attach to the house. So in this example from Coffey Park in the Santa Rosa area in 2017, where the fire ignited this fence, it brought the flame to the adjacent house. The recommendation is to install a metal gate if the fence is to attach to the house. Again, that 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone, such that if the fence does catch on fire, it might not bring and wick the fire all the way to the house. The sixth priority is the siding, and here are a couple demonstration examples of some modular wall units where they've been exposed to flame, and we've got 2 materials that are being compared on the left-hand side. One of them has been treated, so it's designed to resist flame, and you can see that there was a big difference between those 2 types of siding. When you flip around and look at the back side of these wall units, you can see where the flame enters. The flame penetrates between the laps of the siding, so those joints become the place of weakness when it comes to fire. So the recommendation really is to, again, coming back to that non-combustible zone, have this zone around the outside of the house where the siding won't see flame. So that zone should both be horizontal as well as vertical. So the lower right-hand side shows the perimeter foundation giving some additional vertical protection for that siding, as compared to the image on the left where the garden bed is right up adjacent to this wood siding and there's really no protection, no separation for that siding. So the idea in this concept would be to relocate that garden bed away from the house, which would be good for a couple of different reasons in addition to fire, and create both a horizontal and vertical separation from combustible materials. My closing thought is to think about what's around the building you're trying to protect. In this illustration, this is a neighborhood in Santa Rosa, and you can see that we had a house-to-house fire. So the condition of your woodshed, your barn, your garage, your neighbor's house, if it's not well designed to be robust to fire, if it is to accidentally catch on fire, it can really overwhelm your own home. So when it comes time to thinking about defensible space, it's important to think about all buildings and their proximity to each other. My final portion of the presentation is about how to prepare your house prior to wildfire evacuation, which may seem a little bit odd for this theme of talk, but there are a few ideas that I think might be worth paying attention to and might be worth exploring when it comes to thinking about prescribed fire. You'll see evacuation checklists that relate to your animals, your personal welfare. This checklist is about elements associated with your home and your property. If you know that a wildfire is coming or likely to come and you have sufficient time, say in the 4 to 6 hour range in advance of when you're to evacuate, there are some additional concepts that might be helpful to prepare your house. Some of these might be appropriate in preparation for a prescribed fire. Those concepts include cleaning everything up, so like cleaning the gutters, getting those small bits of vegetation away from the house, make a lot of sense. There's also the idea that if you have vents and those vents are not like the new ones that we just showed earlier, you can make some temporary covers for those vents. Those covers could be made out of plywood or they could be made with metal tape. Metal tape may be easier to install in the attic, like on those gable end vents from the inside, but the idea is just to cover over those vents so that you don't have that potential for embers to ignite. Additionally, if you have a water source such as a well or a pump house, you probably want to give some additional lines of protection to those so that there will be water availability throughout the entire fire event. And finally, consider watering the lawn, the deck, and other key pieces. That will provide some additional moisture in those surfaces so they won't be receptive to embers. If you are going to evacuate, you'll eventually want to shut off that water so that you can retain stored water for fire officials to have throughout the event. As it gets closer towards the time to evacuate, there are some other important considerations. Closing windows, for example, closing cat doors, closing the garage are all important so that you can prevent ember entry. Additionally, you might want to take the outside furniture away from your deck, away from your house, the brooms, the doormats, and any of those items that are potentially ignitable. Additionally, think about shutting off the propane tank and moving the barbecue away from the house. And as you're about to evacuate, you might want to consider placing a ladder near the house or other ways, other tools, other resources that if you do have firefighter response, they've got some additional tools at their disposal. This subject can involve a lot more detail, and so I've provided a link here from my colleagues from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety that goes through a nice little checklist to consider. Now, I know we're talking about preparing for prescribed fire, but I think there's a few ideas here that might be worthwhile, such as closing the windows, cleaning up the material that may be around your house, just taking those extra elements of protection, providing some additional watering outside your building, for example. The main point I'd like to leave you with is this idea to work from the house or whatever the building is outward and put your best line of protection immediately around the house. Prescribed fire is a very useful tool, and if you use the defensible space and home hardening principles when planning prescribed fire, I think it'll help guarantee a better element of success. With any prescribed fire, make sure you follow the burn plan prescription and monitor the weather conditions carefully. And this preparation will help you for this prescribed burn and for any future wildfire exposure that you may experience. If you have any additional questions or would like to follow up on these concepts around home hardening and defensible space, there are a number of publications and websites that can provide some additional ideas and information.